In addition to all the interesting context of Carl Jung's education and the societal conditions at the time that he was young and he was going to university, I think it's also really important to consider a bit more what was happening in Europe during Jung's most productive years. If you look at when Jung published, he published a lot of books and material between 1911 and the Second World War. This was a very tumultuous period in the history of Europe, and there is no doubt that Jung was actively affected by what he was witnessing. The period before the First World War was also important to Jung personally, because this was the time when he broke away from Freud. So if we look at sequence of events from the point of view of him publishing, in 1911 he published The Psychology of the Unconscious, which included his groundbreaking ideas on collective unconscious. Then in 1912, Jung and Freud together attended a series of lectures in Munich. Shortly afterwards, their relationship started to deteriorate and they had significant differences in opinion about the nature of psyche. And then eventually Jung and Freud had a falling out, and Jung went on to develop his own brand of psychology, which he called analytical psychology.
We don't talk anymore. We don't talk anymore.
Also worth noting is that Jung traveled around Europe and he gave a series of lectures in London in 1913 and 14. And later on he would refer to this period as the period when he really confronted his unconscious. And then finally in 1916 he published The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, which introduced the concept of the ego, the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious, and hints of individuation process. After World War I ended, Jung traveled again to England and to Europe and to America, and he was even awarded a degree from Oxford University, an honorary degree in 1938. And he published many influential works at that time. A notable one which you probably should be aware of is The Psychological Types. He published Psychological Types in 1921, and then The Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious in 1934. Now, if we look at this entire period of time, Jung started in Switzerland. Switzerland was one of the most industrialized nations in Europe. It had a strong textile and agriculture industry.
18th century, cotton was an exotic luxury worn by the upper classes. But from the 1760s, a wave of technological advances made this fashionable fabric suddenly available to the masses. The demand was huge.
It had a very well-developed network of railways, and the population was relatively well-educated and did not struggle with illiteracy as much as in other parts of the world. There was also a very different political system in Switzerland, and Switzerland remained neutral during both wars. From a more social and geopolitical point of view, one has to consider the fact that Jung was born into a Germanic-speaking culture in Europe in a very different time period. If you look at Europe before World War I, the idea of a nation-state where people speak the same language and live within confines of mostly the same country, it was not widely popular at the time.
In the 19th century, empire and nation are very much entangled with one another.
In fact, I'm going to show you a map of people of Europe and their languages and the borders between countries, and you will struggle to recognize Europe of today. In the last 3 decades of the 19th century and before World War I, European empires have conquered about 20% of Earth's surface, and these were colonial empires that were competing with each other. And this competition was slowly also taking place within Europe and was translating into a nationalist sentiment. At the time, some would say that geopolitics was characterized by social Darwinist orientation. The survival of the fittest, the strongest survive, there are better and worse nations. And in fact, this was really the prelude to two world wars. If you look at the map of Europe between 1910 and 1946, let's say, which is a period that covers the vast majority of Jung's productive years in terms of psychoanalytical theory, you will not only see the signs of falling empires and dissolving states,
The empires we've been studying do come to an end.
but you will also see industrialization being applied to conflict, human suffering, and you will also see a changing view of the relationship between citizens and the state. Now, what I'm trying to basically say here is Carl Jung was a guy who lived through World War I, the Great Depression, the interwar period. He witnessed extreme social transformation, extreme technological transformation, then the terrible atrocities of World War II, and this was all happening in his close cultural sphere. I think what many people don't know is that actually Carl Jung acted as a spy for the Allied forces during World War II, and he was involved in two failed plots to oust Hitler from his position. Jung wanted him declared medically insane, but both of those plots failed. And so, given that this is obviously quite removed from us, we also have to appreciate that Jung, he spoke Latin, Greek, English, French, Italian, German. He was a prolific author and a researcher, brought back to our awareness a lot of materials from other cultures that were not available in any other way. Where you can see it is often in the prefaces to his books, where the translators make disclaimers. So if you look into psychological types, you will see a note from the translators saying that not only they had a difficult time actually translating the words because of different connotations and the usuals, but moreover, they could not find any available English translation of some of the books and myths that Jung was referencing. These items were not available to them. So this means that trying to understand Jung's writing, Jungian psychology, without having a clear access to the secondary literature he is referencing is just going to be difficult. If you have trouble with reading Jung, that's completely normal. If I could recommend one thing to deal with it, is I would start with his students. Many of his students are slightly more accessible just because they lived in a slightly more modern period, and often, they died in 1980s or 1990s, so there's more common ground because of the fact that many of them were American or British and they spoke English as their first language, and secondly because they experienced majority of their adult life, let's say after World War II.